Hello and welcome to the fifth section of our full stack Kotlin application course. In this section we'll be taking a look at Spring Security. We'll configure our Spring Security to the application and implement a user entity to hold the user information like passwords and usernames. We'll also create a service to check against the authorization and authentication. And finally, jump into the world of DSLs in Kotlin and use a small DSL to enable security path injections. In this video, we'll be configuring the Spring Security itself. We'll add Spring Security dependencies to the application, create a module to handle our security, and finally create a config file within that module to configure Spring Security for us. In the previous videos, we created a main config file, and within here we injected or created our beans. We also created a config file for our project module, and now I have created another module in here called user. The naming in here is probably not ideal, but for us that'll work nicely because this module will be holding our user entity as well as our security configuration. So if we jump into the empty build.gradle.kts file that we have available in here, this is the one that we will start populating with dependencies that we need to add enable Spring Security. The first things, of course, for us is to add Spring Boot in there. So we'll add the familiar Spring Boot dependencies. We will also pull out the Spring Boot version like we have been doing previously. So we'll go to parent properties and get the Spring Boot version. And we, in this case, get a Spring Security version as well. This is due to the timing of the video. Spring Security is not bundled into Spring Boot quite yet. So I will be using the Spring Security from the actual Spring Framework module instead. And the final bits in here will be to add the Spring Security dependencies themselves. So we will add 3 different dependencies: Spring Security Core, Config, and Webflux. Webflux, as you know, is our web server implementation on top of Netty. And now that we have these Spring Boot version and Spring Security version defined in our build.gradle, let's check our Gradle properties file and bump up the versions to match together. So we will be using snapshot versions for this video, but when this one comes out, there should be a final release of both Spring Boot and Spring Security already. Now that we have the dependencies added, we can create our config file. So let's create a file called user.config, and within this file we will be starting to create our Spring Boot configurations. This will be a single function within our file, so we'll create a function called security beans that is of type unit, so it doesn't return anything. And within that security beans function, we will just call the exposed bean function and create a new bean called type security web filter chain, that is, of course. So now we have our bean definition and we need to just provide security configuration that we want to do. So the first thing to do is we want to create an HTTP security. Provides us with a builder with the function HTTP, so we'll call that. And from the builder then we start building actual authorization. So we'll create authorization exchange, and now that we have the exchange available for us, we can start piping in together or chaining together our paths. So the next step is to create a few path matchers in here. The first one is HTTP method get, and all API project get methods we will permit so everyone can view our API in this case, and API post methods into our projects folder. They need to have an admin, So let's make that API projects. And now that we have that available for us, we can actually provide a new path matcher. So we'll restrict our projects so that anyone or no one in this case can actually view our pages. So we have projects view page exposed for us through the view handler. So now that we have our paths defined, we can jump into the next line and just do a small function called anyExchange, and we tell our Spring Security builder that we want all exchanges to be authenticated. And now we have everything ready to build. So we, instead of creating a configuration class for us, we just created a security piece function that extends the bean definition DSL. So an extension function to that. And now that we have that available for us, we can jump into the config file itself and actually just call our security beans function. This way, we don't need to create a config file, and we can use the bean registration style for our Spring Boot. The other thing we need to do is enable the web flux security itself. So we'll add an additional annotation to our main config file as well. Note that we did add a project compile time dependency for our backend user module. So that will be built on top of our config, and now therefore that security beans function that we create is available for our main config file. So if we hit Ctrl F5 to let the Spring or IntelliJ start our Spring application, and let's look at the logs. And the application is up and running. Everything seems to be starting fine. We can jump into our REST client. So API project was the endpoint that was available for all. See if we can reach that. That is responding nicely. And if we jump into our API project and try to do a post on it, we should be getting back 401 unauthorized from there, like we do. And we also made a change. So if we do an attempt to open the project's view, we should be getting an authentication required. So it wants us to do a standard HTTP basic authentication to access this page. That is everything for this video, and we will be seeing how to actually do the HTTP authentication for us in the next video.